Delegates, advisors, and distinguished guests, good evening. I'm Philip Crane, the Secretary General and Chief Executive Officer of MUNUC. And on behalf of the entire staff, it's my pleasure to welcome you to the 28th session of Model United Nations of the University of Chicago. For many of us, this has been a long time coming. For the last year now, our staff of nearly 200 University of Chicago students has been working to make this conference a reality. School advisors have spent months coaching their delegates, and delegates have been conducting exhaustive research and preparing their positions. Standing here, I cannot be more ecstatic to watch all of this come to life tonight. By many measures, this is already a particularly special MUNUC. To review the numbers, this weekend we have 2,626 delegates who have spent weeks preparing to debate the issues most pressing to our delegates, our global society. This is the largest number hosted by any MUNUC conference in our 28-year history. And delegates, you're joined by 259 school advisors who have given up weekends and taken on extra commitments to bring you here. We come from 14 states and 11 countries, making this the most diverse and international MUNUC ever. The numbers aside, what will make this conference one for the record books is all of the individual successes each of you will achieve over the next few days. What will make this opportunity a once-in-a-lifetime experience is your choices, big and small, in and outside of the committee room. These can take many forms, and over the past 28 years, we've seen all types. Only at MUNUC does a shy student, nervous about speaking in front of large groups, raise his placard to make a speech before his fellow DISEC delegates. Only at MUNUC does a freshman in high school dare to debate the nitty-gritty of international economic policy in the G20. And only at MUNUC do you make new friends from the other side of the city and the other side of the world during a late-night Frappuccino-fueled working session. These are the success stories of MUNUC that we see time and time again. And for our staff, this is why we return year after year, to make these possibilities a reality for a new generation of students. MUNUC is a truly unique opportunity to challenge yourself, to pick up a new skill, to grow as a person, or to make a new friend. Why else do Model UN? When you think about it, it's a bit of a strange activity, blending together high politics, oration, and a healthy dose of thespianism. I imagine many have trouble explaining the concept to friends unacquainted with MUN. Maybe you talk about negotiation and public speaking, research and writing, or perhaps role-playing. But when I'm asked why MUN, I have only three things to say. First, the opportunity to meet new people. The best thing about MUNUC is the thousands of students we bring together from around the world. Introduce yourself to someone new. Spend time with your new friends, and keep in touch long after this conference closes. A year from now, you'll forget which resolution was passed or by what margin, but you will keep these friendships for the rest of your lives. Second, have fun. This may be a rigorous academic exercise in world politics, but it's also a great time. Work hard, prepare for session, take this academic opportunity seriously, for it's far rarer than you might think, but at the same time have fun with it. Spend time with your friends in between sessions. Take the opportunity to make memories you'll relish long after conference has ended. Third, finally, and most importantly, learn by doing. Here at MUNUC, we have a phrase that we use to describe our academic program. In 2 words, practical pedagogy. Learning does not just happen from reading a book or attending a lecture. In its most impactful form, it happens by doing. And this is why we come to MUNUC and assume the role of diplomats for the weekend. It's because through the exercise of solving the world's problem, you will become a stronger student, a more eloquent speaker, a more effective global citizen, and a better you. What you learn here will stay with you long after MUNUC closes on Sunday. Please take a moment this weekend to reflect on your successes, your failures, and your personal growth. And I hope each of you leaves with an unwavering recognition of the achievements you've made along the way. Thank you, and once again, welcome to MUNUC 28. Now, I would like to turn the podium over to Mr. Peter Erskine, MUNUC's Chief Financial Officer, who will introduce tonight's first guest speaker.
It is my pleasure tonight to introduce the University of Chicago's guest speaker for tonight, James G. Nondorf. Jim is the Vice President for Enrollment and Student Advancement and Dean of Admissions and Financial Aid at the University of Chicago. At UChicago, Dean Nondorf oversees college admissions, graduate admissions, financial aid, and the Office of Career Advancement. He has also served as chair of the SAT Committee and been an advisor for the College Board. Prior to his tenure at the University of Chicago, he served as Vice President and Dean of Admissions and Financial Aid at Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute and Director of Student Outreach and Associate Director of Admissions at Yale University. Dean Nondorf earned a BA in Economics from Yale University and an MLA in Ethics from Valparaiso University. I have the pleasure of working for Dean Nondorf as a tour guide in the admissions office at UChicago, and he is an incredibly inspiring boss and a real pleasure to work for. The environment he creates is one of inclusion, hard work, and of course fun through his proponent of buying the student workers milkshakes every Wednesday. Since coming to UChicago, Dean Nondorf has made a real difference to the UChicago community through his work in the admissions office. And I believe how UChicago today is in large part thanks to Dean Nondorf. So please join me in welcoming UChicago's Dean Jim Nondorf.
Okay, well, hello. Welcome to Chicago. This is, all right, yeah, this is going to be great. So, I'd just like to, really the main purpose of my talk, it will be short, yay, is to give you some advice about the next few years and also perhaps one piece of advice about admissions. Don't think about it if you're only a freshman, but as you get older, eventually you might think about college. So, first of all, you are doing the right thing. Because I have not gotten out of bed in 2 days. I've been down with the flu, but I hauled myself up because I wanted to speak to you guys. So no Dean of Admissions would do that unless they loved MUN. So you're doing a great extracurricular activity. We know you're smart when I'm reading applications and you're participating in this. I know you're smart. You're much smarter than those other kinds of debatey kind of things, I know. So, yeah, boo for them, yes. And actually, I want you to know that you can relax. Everything is going to work out. You know, whether it's tomorrow and your proposal gets shot down, or whether it is, 4 years from now if you're a freshman, or next year. Are there any seniors here who have already gotten into college? All right. So this tells you people do get admitted to school. It really happens. Now here's the cautionary note for you. So at Chicago, we had 31,000 applications this year for my 1,500 spots. So we're probably going to admit about 7%. And I'm telling you this because now I'm about to give you two pieces of advice about the admissions process. That is, all of the chairs have been given the secret Dean of Admissions passcode, so if you are really, really good, they send notes to me and I forward them to all of the other Ivy and MIT and Stanford. No, that doesn't really happen. Oh my God, you looked so serious when I said that there, young lady. But I will tell you on a serious note, every year, I hope you have a wonderful, wonderful time. I really do. I want this to be as awesome as you just described it. But please do not do anything that you should not do as high school students in the wonderful city of Chicago. Every year I have the pleasure or displeasure of reading in that supplemental essay section about the student who went to MUN or debate or went somewhere and had a little more fun than a 17-year-old should have. You do not fare well in the application process when that happens. So please, help me, help you, help you. Please just have a great time, but don't do anything that is going to get you a disciplinary action upon your return to your high schools, because I'm actually a little serious, but I wanted to just point that out. And so, really, I hope you have a great time. Work hard, but I hope you're doing this because you love it. Not because you think it's going to look good on your resume, which it does, but because you love it, because that's what you should be doing in high school. You can have a great high school experience, study hard, learn a lot, and have fun, and still get into any of the top schools. So try not to worry about us, live in the moment, and good luck, and thank you for having me. Now, unfortunately, I still have several hundred students to reject tonight, so I'm going to leave right now. So I'll see you all later.
Dean Nondorf, thank you for those very poignant remarks. For delegates looking for G-rated activities in the Chicago area for the duration of the weekend, you will find those in your delegate handbooks. At this time, I will now turn the podium over to Elizabeth Green, MUNUC's Chief of Staff and Undersecretary General for Regional Bodies, to introduce our second guest speaker of the evening.
Hello, MUNUC 28. I would like to introduce our next speaker, Matthew McInnes. Mr. McInnes is a resident fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, where his work focuses on Iran, specifically its intentions, strategic culture, military power, and goals. He also works on U.S. defense and regional security issues in the Persian Gulf and on the effectiveness of the U.S. intelligence community. Before joining AEI, Mr. McInnes served as a senior analyst and in a variety of other leadership positions within the United States Department of Defense. After his speech, Mr. McInnes will be taking a few questions from the delegates. We ask you to keep your questions short and to the point. Please help me in warmly welcoming Mr. Matthew McInnes.
Thank you, and thank you so much, University of Chicago, for putting this on. I'm just overwhelmed seeing this group here. I did Model UN in college, not high school, but it was an amazing experience for me. And it's one of the things that when coming here, and I didn't quite realize what I was walking into at this conference and just the amazing work that's being put into it. But for me, I've learned in my life, in my career, that I'm pretty much doing versions of Model UN most of the time, that the kind of work that you do here, of getting inside other states, inside their minds, inside the dynamics of having to compete, having to find solutions, having to deal with conflict, winning when you do have conflict. These are all things that I not only experienced when I did Model UN, but it's something that I've carried through all of my years working both for the Pentagon as well as now as a resident fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. And why is that? Partly it's because if you really want to understand and solve problems, you have to get deep into them. You have to really take apart the motivations, the factors, the external variables, the internal variables, things that can be controlled, things that cannot be controlled. What are the possibilities? What can you do? What can you not do? And this is something that I found, and I think many of you will find in your college careers and hopefully in your careers in life, that this type of understanding, this development of empathy for how people behave and what motivates them, and how you can work with that, how you can stop bad behavior, how you can encourage good behavior. It's something that, again, is invaluable for what you're going to do, again, in these years in school as well as in life. And it's interesting, I spent a lot of time at the Pentagon over the years, and another place I served in Tampa, Florida, U.S. Central Command, where I was the senior Iran expert under General Petraeus and General John Allen and General Jim Mattis, is that I also spent a lot of time basically doing Model UN with them. And where we would spend time wargaming, and putting the U.S. up against Iran, trying to understand how Iran would react in different scenarios. During this time in my career, this was a period of great tension. We were not starting the nuclear negotiations. President Obama's outreach was not working at that time. We were worried that Israel was going to launch a strike on Iran's nuclear facilities. And we very much worried about what would the impact of that be, and what would be the retaliation from Iran, what would be the nature of that. And we had to prepare for that and understand it and anticipate it, hopefully defend against it, and respond to it effectively if needed. And this required, again, a lot of crisis simulation, a lot of thinking through the nature of Iranian decision-making, understanding the nature of the decision-making of our allies, of the Gulf Arab states, of Iraq, of Israel, perhaps Turkey, other members of NATO. Would China or Russia intervene in that situation? It was a huge question. Obviously, I think many people underestimated how willing Russia, or at least Vladimir Putin, would be in intervening directly in the Middle East. And that's one of the things in retrospect, we left out of our simulations, and is creating, frankly, a very new reality in the Middle East. And so what I wanted to take a few minutes talking about on the substantive side of this is really looking at, frankly, the current United Nations failure of trying to get effective Syrian peace talks going. And part of the reason, and looking into why that is. And I hope a little discussion of this will help inform your thinking this week on how you should approach these types of problems, and understanding even the best diplomats really get it wrong sometimes. In fact, they get it wrong a lot of times. But I do think we, as in the US, and our partners, as well as our competitors and adversaries around the globe, we can do better at understanding those factors of what motivates behavior, what people are trying to achieve, how can we communicate what we want effectively, how can we get what we want effectively, how can we stop people from getting what we don't want them to get. These are the key questions, and I think, frankly, what's happening right now in trying to resolve the Syria crisis is, aside from the fact that it is potentially an unsolvable problem, which is the really scary part, but also that we're not understanding what's motivating all the key players and really what's happening in the landscape right now. In many ways, you have a situation in Syria where you have the main players, whether it's President Assad and his forces, whether it's Iran and their efforts to build up a new military and a new proxy force for President Assad, because President Assad's military can't really do much. And understanding what's really the fact that Iran is going to do whatever it can to salvage President Assad. And it's one of the things that was a key failure early on in US policy in 2011 and 2012 when the civil war began, was the expectation that President Assad can't last. Just like President Mubarak in Egypt, President of Tunisia, others that fell, Saleh in Yemen, that there's no way he can stand up to the revolt of most of his people. People underestimated and didn't really get inside the mind of Iran in this situation and recognize that, no, actually, Syria is an existential problem for Iran. Iran depends on Syria to deter Israel and to support its main proxy, Lebanese Hezbollah. And frankly, if they lose that, if they lose Syria, Iran is going to frankly feel extremely naked in the Middle East. And because of that, it's going to do whatever it can to keep Assad in power. And so what we've seen over the last 4 or 5 years is an increasing escalation of Iranian involvement in Syria in order to ensure that President Assad, some form of the state, survives. And we misunderstood that, and I think in many ways we still underestimate how essential this is for Iranian strategy. We also underestimated exactly how Turkey was going to play in this situation. and about how this was, in some ways, classic strategy, but also personality politics, which is an important thing. You know, President Erdogan used to be very close to President Assad. They saw themselves as brothers trying to lead, you know, a modern, you know, Muslim, you know, modernization of the modern Muslim world. And then there was a real falling out. And President Erdogan felt that President Assad betrayed him and did something he thought he would never do. And Erdogan refused to talk to Assad again. And because of that one personality conflict, you ended up breaking up a whole new element of the conflict that allowed a porous border to open, that allowed groups ultimately like ISIS or Jabhat al-Nusra, the al-Qaeda element there, you know, to be able to flow foreign fighters in from Turkey. And so that created a huge issue. And then we underestimated how much Saudi Arabia was scared, frankly, of having this conflict evolve to the point where Iran would become so dominant in Syria and control so much of the Syrian state that they themselves were going to have to intervene. Of course, the problem is Saudi Arabia doesn't really have a good military to do that, so what it does is it sends a lot of money to various groups. So that happened. And then the US, of course, you know, we kind of equivocate in this situation. We don't know what to do. We're terrified of going in because of the legacy of Iraq, legacy of Afghanistan. And so we try to stay away from what's happening as much as possible. We do involve ourselves somewhat, but yet we're not willing to kind of go in there. And this doesn't necessarily mean lots of boots on the ground, but we're not willing to really engage in the system and put the weight of US leadership into that environment. And so all the states and actors in this situation that could potentially come in and help tamp down the civil war, to help contain it, none of them feel like the US is really going to come in very strongly on one side or the other. And you have all these players increasingly going into this cycle of fear and need to continue to increase their investment in Syria, to a point where the escalation cycle doesn't seem like it's going to be able to end. And that's what's really, really scary. And then you add in the past 6 months, Russian intervention. And in many ways, there's probably, of all the profound things that have happened since the Arab Spring in 2011, the reintroduction of Russia into this is one of the most, in some ways, surprising, but also potentially the most important. Because Russia has not been involved to this degree in the Middle East for some time. And it sees in the potential of having a new naval base, a new air base on the Syrian coast on the Mediterranean as a capacity that it has never even had during the Cold War. The ability to send ships, to send fighter aircraft across the Mediterranean is a challenge to the balance of power in Europe and the Mediterranean vis-a-vis NATO that we never, again, faced in the Cold War. And frankly, you know, we haven't had the situation where with Russia with that type of power projection, if you want to say, since you know, sometime in the 18th century. And so this is beginning to change. We have, you know, because of our unwillingness to take some risk and to have a more forceful understanding of what the actors want, how far they're willing to go to get what they want, and willingness to show and take risks in leadership, we have a situation that is spinning out of control. And what's really scary is the fact that unlike other situations like we had in the Cold War, or for example, after the Congress of Vienna in the 19th century, where conflict happened, conflict blew up, but inevitably when the system was working, there was a way that the great powers and other forces would find ways to tamp it down and to eventually bring de-escalation to conflict. And where that broke down, when this international system was breaking down, that's when the escalation, as you saw in the lead up to World War I, and of course during the interwar period, where there was nothing to stop the escalation because the system, the inherent system, was broken. And that's the point that we're at right now, is, you know, in the post-Cold War and in, frankly, the post-Iraq War period, we don't really know what the system, how it's working, if it's working, and really what the US role needs to be what Europe's role needs to be, how to deal with, with Putin and Russia. Is China really going to play a role in all this? The system doesn't really know where things are going. And because of that, and because we're not spending the time getting inside the heads of our allies and our adversaries, as well as understanding, ultimately what groups like ISIS and Jabhat al-Nusra and others are capable of and want to do and are willing to do, and they take advantage of this degree of chaos, that we're in a situation where the escalation may not be able to end. And that's what you're seeing in the Syria peace talks, is that right now, no one's really there yet when it comes to being willing to stop fighting. Certainly, many want humanitarian relief, many want to be able to break the sieges, bring in medical relief, evacuate people, exchange prisoners. But again, we're not appreciating what Russia really wants to do here, what Iran wants to do here, how far Assad is willing to go. They're frankly more focused, and this is classic Clausewitz for those of you that have studied that, they recognize that they've got to change. They want a political solution ultimately that satisfies their interests. Perhaps a partition of Syria, perhaps some new version of spheres of influence. But they recognize they need to change the battlefield first. They're not ready really to talk. And I hope Secretary John Kerry has recognized that in the end, the key actors have other motivations right now aside from peace. And they want to change the situation. And maybe they'll talk at some point in time, but only after they've achieved what they want. So again, in that context, I hope that we're hopefully in a period of time where new ideas, new thoughts are going to emerge about how to manage crises like the Syrian crisis. And I don't really know if you can't tamp down the Syrian crisis, the way it's spinning in places like Europe and and perhaps even in the U.S., we're going to be in a situation where it can't be de-escalated, and it's going to affect profoundly the world that all of you go into after your post-college life. I hope we're able to get out of that. I hope you're able to learn here valuable tools to be able to have better ideas of how to get inside people's heads, about how to make the right thing happen, how to keep the wrong thing from happening. And again, above all, I hope you have a lot of fun here this week too. Sorry for being so grim. But again, thank you very much for having me here. I'm thrilled to be speaking. And I think this is going to be an incredibly exciting time for you guys. And I am open for questions. Okay.
Caleb, come on up here.
Okay, we have about 15 minutes for questions. So keep them short
Okay.
so we can actually get to as many as we can.
Okay. So when faced with a global issue like in Iraq, what, in your opinion, is the most difficult step in finding a solution?
You have to say that again.
Okay. When faced with a global issue like in Iraq, what, in your opinion, is the most difficult step in finding a solution?
You're talking about Iraq. I think the most difficult thing we have to do in that situation is find a way to support what actually is kind of working right now and not lose what is working right now, which is Prime Minister Abadi. I'm very much afraid that Prime Minister Abadi is not going to last much longer. And Iran is very unhappy with how he's handling things. And I do think the Iranians are looking to find ways to move Prime Minister Abadi out. I also have to give credit at this point to Special Envoy Staffan de Mistura from the United Nations in understanding, keeping some of the Arab-Kurd conflict that's happening, recognizing that in some ways, as opposed to going in like Secretary Kerry is in Syria and trying to dig right in and fix all the problems right away, is actually recognizing what is it that would make this situation worse, and how do I keep that from happening? And so Staffan de Mistura is playing a much more clever game as a UN diplomat, and being able to distract some of those key players from making some decisions about who controls oil and who controls revenue. Is Kurdistan going to separate? Keeping those issues off the table, for now at least, or at least pushing them to the back burner so that the real problems can be addressed more fully. So that really comes down to in situations that are potentially long-term intractable, is maybe just deciding what you need to at least prevent from happening, so you can let other things maybe on down the road, good things happen.
Thank you.
How effective were the sanctions, the U.S. sanctions on Iran, actually?
The question was, how effective were the sanctions on Iran? I actually think they were very effective.
Yeah.
I think that the Iranians, of course, have enormous economic problems on their own. They didn't need U.S. and European sanctions to mismanage their economy severely. But the sanctions came in on top of that, and it was extremely painful for the Iranian leadership. It's the reason why I opposed to some of my colleagues in the business, I really did think the Supreme Leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, really wanted to have a deal because he knew he needed to get out from underneath the sanctions. And I think that you're in a situation there where the Iranians, frankly, had decided they don't need a nuclear weapon right now. They can wait until they have the capacity to perhaps have a full nuclear arsenal in, say, 15 years. I talk about this a lot, that I don't think the Iranians were trying to sneak away and have like 1 or 2 bombs like North Korea. If they're going to do something serious, they're going to come out like Pakistan did with a significant nuclear arsenal if they're going to do that. And they're not in any position to make 50, 60 weapons or anytime in the near future. And so they made a decision that, hey, let's take some time. We can't really get what we want right now anyway. We're going to give up some of our nuclear program, put it on hold, keep on doing some of the research and development that we want to do. And then in 2030, they'll be in a position, if they choose to do so, I'm not saying they will definitely do this, but they will be in a position to create something like a nuclear arsenal, if they want to, more along the lines of what Pakistan or Israel or India have. And that's what's really kind of scary, but it's also what I think is, again, shows the power of, the Iranians still didn't want to have to do what they did, but they did it because of the sanctions. And it's something the next president in 2017 still has a lot of tools that he or she can use to put pressure on Iran despite the nuclear deal. There's still all sorts of sanctions about their missile program, their conventional weapons program, human rights, support for terrorism, a whole array of things that the next president can use to pressure Iran to help prevent some of its more destabilizing behavior. So I'm all for sanctions. They don't solve everything, but they are a good tool.
Awesome, thank you. It seems as though the U.S. has taken a leading role in trying to prevent any sort of humanitarian crisis from going around in the world. How come the U.S. doesn't try to work through the United Nations more to solve these problems?
Well, I think, the U.S. does try to work through the United Nations as much as they can. I think that Samantha Power, our ambassador, is very passionate about what you're describing. I think at times, to be frank, Samantha Power would like for the U.S. to do more than President Obama will allow. And that's kind of the core of some of the internal fighting inside the White House and between our mission in New York. But I do think that, there's a huge question that the U.S. has to face, and it's a very tough one, about whether, when to go in for humanitarian intervention. Because obviously we don't go in for every single one of them. And there are choices that have to be made about which ones are worth potentially, risking our lives, UN peacekeeper lives, allies' lives. Will intervention make things worse? There's all sorts of questions, and the reason why it's so tough. But I do think that the U.S., it went through a period in the 1990s, the exception of Rwanda, and what happened in Srebrenica. But in some ways because of Rwanda and Srebrenica, that the U.S. began to, certainly under Madeleine Albright and others, really felt that humanitarian intervention was something that the U.S. needs to do when it can. And I think to some degree, maybe not for all the people in the Bush administration, but for at least for President Bush, there was a certain sense of humanitarian motivation to, from his perspective, help the Afghan people, help the Iraqi people. It may not have turned out like that. But I think that there is that motivation because of Iraq and because of, in many ways because of President Obama's worldview. There's a lot of hesitancy to do humanitarian intervention, and I think it's very interesting. And right now, the presidential debate's happening between, Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders, and it'd be very interesting to hear what those two would have to say about humanitarian intervention, because I think they probably have very different ideas. And so it is something that I think ultimately comes down to a domestic U.S. political question of what's worth using force for and what's worth risking U.S. soldiers' lives.
Thank you.
So you talked a lot about getting inside people's heads, and that takes experience. So I was wondering, what are some surprising ideas or concepts that you've learned through experience by getting into people's heads?
Yeah, because, getting inside, one thing, I'm sure most of you know this, other people are not, there's a problem that you usually have when people try to think about this, is either they want to mirror image and kind of expect that the other person thinks like they do and behaves like they would, or are rational actors, and sometimes I hate that term, from their perspective. And then you have others that tend to want to make the other really the other, that there's no way to understand them. They're mysterious, they're opaque. I actually run into this, I call it intellectual laziness that I find in Washington among Iran watchers, for example, is that they love to say that the Iranian regime is just, you never know what the supreme leader is really thinking. It's too opaque. Who knows what's going on inside Tehran? And I think, well, yeah, it's just hard, but I think you can know it. But I think there's another tendency to, make things look, I think this happens in our diplomatic negotiations, is especially when we're engaging with them, we want to see them too much like ourselves. I think to some degree that Secretary Kerry and Foreign Minister Javad Zarif from Iran have become so close to each other, and they think they know each other, that I think is actually quite, in some ways you can know someone too well and you stop being objective about their behavior. You become a little too close to them personally. So you have to kind of go between these two poles of believing that they're just like you, and you can just think, oh, I would do this in that situation, to I have no idea what they're going to do. That there's something, the truth is really somewhere in between, and it really comes down to, understanding their history, watching what they say, and watching what they do, which sometimes are two different things, but they're very much related. What they say is not always just rhetoric. It means something. I spend most of my time, now that I'm out of government, I don't look at all the secrets. I have to read what the Iranians say, as well as observe what they do. So I have to use both those sets of data to understand their behavior and what they want, and frankly, getting inside the personalities. That's so much of it is like a mass psychological experiment. You're trying to understand everyone's background and mindset, how they all come together, how they form consensus about decisions. So that's really what I found over the years. It's a very complex research project, but the more you can kind of let go of either those two poles of we can't understand them or they're just going to act like us, the better you're going to be.
Thank you.
First of all, thank you for speaking here today. And my question is, once you've encountered worldwide problems such as Syria or Iran, what is your first step to solving the issue?
The first step is always defining the problem. I think that's usually where we get things wrong. The second layer is then being willing to actually do what it will take to solve the problem. Those are where everything tends to fall apart. We have I think in the US, and I think all countries deal with this to a certain degree, is that we don't spend the kind of time we need to really unpack the problem. A lot of times there's a certain kind of approach to look at things superficially. If I take, for example, the fight against ISIS and what's happening in Syria, is that you end up in a situation where we think because Iran says it's against ISIS, because Russia says it's against ISIS, that therefore we can align with Russia and Iran against ISIS. And that's not, as I was mentioning in my talk, yes, they're kind of against ISIS, but they're actually really much more about preserving President Assad. And the same thing in Iraq, where yes, they're against ISIS, but they have interest in what they're doing to reshape the Iraqi government and its security apparatus to become more Iranianized, that they're worried that their objectives are ultimately going to clash with ours. I think there's this tendency to want to see the ISIS problem, for example, like World War II, where we worked with the Soviet Union against the Nazis. And there was a clear, yes, we recognize we have different ideologies, but we have a very clear common enemy, and it's the number one enemy for both of us. The problem with Syria is because we keep wanting to think that ISIS is also the number one problem, for Russia and Iran, and it's not. And that's the reason why we continue to kind of bounce off and not get things right.
Thank you.
Hello. What inspired you to enter this line of work, and how would someone with a passion for this enter your line of work?
I've always been kind of a geek about, these types of issues, when it comes to international relations and understanding. I mean, ultimately, I'm not an IR guy. I'm a comparativist. So I've always been fascinated by diving into other countries, other actors, understanding their mentality, and then approaching my international relations theory is usually a cumulative process of adding all that up together and playing it out. That's the reason why I try to do versions of Model UN, wargaming, whenever I have a chance. And so I think for me, it's just I'm fascinated by people and why they do what they do, and how that then plays out into international relations and how the world works. Why not?
All right, thank you.
Oftentimes, countries have to work together to come to solutions despite the fact that they have discrete differences with each other. What do you consider America's potential for working directly with the 4+1 coalition?
4+1 coalition being?
Syria, Iran, Iraq, Russia,
whatever.
Hezbollah.
Again, I think that there are some discrete things that can be done, but as I was mentioning before, I fear that we don't quite appreciate that the Russians, the Syrians, and the Iranians, and Hezbollah all have different end-state objectives than we do. The main thing, when you take ISIS, for example, President Assad was very cynical about the use of ISIS. He saw ISIS develop and actually realized that it was a good thing for him for a while because it mainly focused on the rebels that he was most worried about. So he looked at ISIS as the enemy of his enemy. Even if ISIS ultimately may want to overthrow him, and he understands that, he knows that in the near term, ISIS is actually a benefit to him. And Iran felt the same way. They didn't feel that way in Iraq, which is a little bit different because Iraq, they almost threatened the Iranian border. But in Syria, at least, the most important thing is preserving Assad for that 4+1 group. And so I think that the U.S. trying, and the French and other players trying to more align with Assad or with Russia or with Iran in this, I think in the end it's just not, you're not going to get a solution out of that because we don't actually want the same things right now. Maybe in the future it would work out better, but ultimately the Russians and the Iranians in particular want the U.S. out of the Middle East. And they're going to continue to do whatever, no matter what we do discreetly with them cooperating, in the end, they're going to want to do things to make sure that we leave, and that may not be a gentle request.
Thank you.
In your experience, do you think this age of technology, communication, and media allow more of the escalation of fear that you were talking about, or can it facilitate productive conversation?
No, I think it's an interesting question about whether in the modern world, the advent of everything from Twitter, social media, does that allow, cyber warfare? I still think that there are certain containment on escalation. I mean, obviously, we have enough nuclear weapons in the world to keep things from, necessarily going nuclear, ironically, which is what happened during the Cold War. But I do think that there's a kind of an interesting thing within the cyber realm, and I'm actually doing some research on cyber doctrine for Iran in the US, and there's still a lot of sense of proportionality in the sense of, if Iran does a cyber attack against the US, we don't think, oh, we're going to respond with Tomahawk missiles. That's not a symmetrical response. And I think there's still as much damage as can be done by a cyber attack. I still think there is an unwillingness to have something like cyber escalate into full-out conventional warfare. And that's the reason why I'm hoping that remains relatively true, that there's a certain proportionality that if they hit you one way, you try to kind of hit them back the other, maybe a little bit harder, or maybe you're signaling a de-escalation where you just have to do an honor hit to show them that you can still punch back, but really you don't want to fight anymore. Which is actually what the Iranians do most of the time. They like to have like an honor punch and back away pretty quickly. We never get that. We think that honor punch is actually something bigger, and we escalate. This is what I call the escalation trap that we get into with Iran sometimes. So that I think that it opens up a certain degree of risk for greater escalation, but I still think there's a lot in the system inherently that keeps things tamping down. But with what's happening in Syria, it may be rewriting the rules right now.
Thank you.
Do we have time for one more? How many? That's it? Okay. I think we have to cut it off at this point. I'm sorry.
One more.
Sir.
I will hang out somewhere, hopefully not creepily. If you guys want to come up and ask questions more, that'd be great.
Mr. McInnes, thank you so much for joining us tonight and for your remarks before the audience. Could everyone join me in thanking Mr. McInnes one more time? And again, he has graciously offered to pan around outside the room after the opening ceremony. So if anybody has any additional questions, I think he can spend a few minutes with you. But for a few closing words, I would like to return to this idea of practical pedagogy that I spoke about at the beginning. It's our guiding principle, and it's about how learning by doing is learning at its most effective. And one part of this idea is the idea that experience translates theory to real-world application. But the other part is that impactful learning requires a commitment to actionable self-awareness of weakness and the dedication to work to overcome it. Now, our staff has committed itself to this principle, and it will be a part of every committee that you partake in this weekend. At any time, I encourage you to ask your DAIA staff for advice on how to improve. They'll provide you with actionable feedback and will work with you to implement it over the course of the weekend. We just ask that you take the initiative to come to us. Delegates, for you, this means taking a moment right here and now to honestly reflect on what you want this conference experience to mean for you and what you hope to take away from it on Sunday. Do you want to become a more confident public speaker or a shrewder negotiator? Perhaps it's to become a clearer writer or develop a more thorough understanding of a tricky piece of international law. Whatever it is for you, think of MUNUC as an opportunity to make that happen. And we're here to help. So I leave you with the challenge to set for yourself a single personal goal for the weekend. We're going to do everything we possibly can to help you to achieve that. Best of luck this weekend, and make the most of it. Thank you. And at this point in time, the chair would look favorably upon a motion to open MUNUC 28. Okay, we have a motion. Is there a second? All in favor? This motion clearly passes. MUNUC 28 is officially open.